Most people would assume that we all have a clear picture of the story of Glendalough. Lines were drawn years ago with nothing to add. But the real picture is far more complex than the ancient tales would have us believe.
It's such a well-known landscape, such a famous landscape. There are particular images of it that are iconic, and people would always think that, well, we must know everything about Glendalough. And there's been some really good work done, but most of it a very, very long time ago. So there's been very, very little recent archaeological fieldwork.
Well, my first experience was coming up and down each year with the students to our then training excavation at the site of Templeton. And while we were there, we would bring the students to Glendalough, and we'd have an opportunity to explore the valley, but very much from the outside. And it was over those times that conversations started to develop about how we'd like to work in Glendalough Valley.
We did not want to tell the story of the monastery. We did not want to get hooked into that part of it. But what we wanted to show people was how this landscape had changed over time, how people had changed the landscape and how the landscape had changed people. Now, we ended up digging within a stone's throw of the bloody monastic complex itself, but it is that broader story of how this landscape has changed over time that's the really, really important and interesting one.
There's a number of notable contributions by archaeologists, but it tends to be about the standing architecture of the site. But the fact that nobody had done geophysical surveys and there hadn't been any research excavations in a very, very long time. So we thought that's what we can bring to bear.
And you are very welcome to our excavations here in Glendalough. This is our main undergraduate training excavation, which takes place in August of each year. It's one of the things that makes archaeology slightly different than other subjects is it's a practical and a field discipline.
Any student of early medieval Irish history is going to realise that it's probably the top 4 early medieval sites in the country. And then you add on top of that the opportunity to be in such a beautiful place, such a beautiful location. And there's nowhere, I think, in Ireland and possibly in the British Isles that has such a concentration of 12th century buildings all in the one location.
What I love about Glendalough as a landscape is that actually as you work here, the real story is much more complicated and much more interesting. So the landscape as we see it now, which everyone looks out and sees as a beautiful natural landscape with woodland rising on both sides of the valley as you look up towards the end of the upper lake, what you're looking at there is a post-industrial landscape. It's a landscape that's been transformed by charcoal production of the 17th century, which was an English colonial industry where they came in and they stripped the landscape bare of trees in order to produce charcoal for iron smelting. The trees that you see there now on the south side of the valley, that's semi-natural regrowth. On the north side of the valley, that's all trees which were planted for the lead mines, which ran at the head of the valley from 1850 discontinuously through the 20th century.
Most of what we can see above the ground in terms of the church buildings are 11th to 12th century. But there are 120 cross slabs and grave slabs and crosses and other monuments, some of which date back earlier again. But there's very little materially to date back to the time of the foundation of the site, which is reputedly, if you go with St. Kevin, in the 6th, 7th century. In order to think about where we might look for evidence, we have the practical constraints of we don't want to excavate within the burial ground at the core of the site for obvious reasons. So what you're left with then is the spaces between the buildings at the edge of the monastic site or the buildings at the upper lake.
So we're going to try and lift/turn this.
When we came here initially, there was always 2 parts to the story for us. One was research to do with the sites that we've been exploring in Glendalough and outside the valley. And then there's also the training and development of students. So it's a student training excavation was one of our major motivations.
Yeah, so we need to lift.
No, that way.
Well, and then as that went on over time, the very obvious extra dimension that developed was to start working with the community, start looking at increasing what we present to members of the public who happen to be passing by. And so we now probably have the 3 strands of community, research and teaching. As a shared experience, it's great. As a historical inquiry and adventure, it's great. In its totality, it's something that people generally enjoy.
I suppose I was kind of overwhelmed when I first came down. I didn't realise how big the landscape was, the footfall, how many people were here, how many people were interested. I suppose when we were actually working down on the site beside the main monastic complex, you know, you could see how many people were coming up and were interested, so you kind of got a sense of how important the work you were doing was. So yeah, I suppose my first impression was, oh wow, like the job we're doing is important and it means so much to other people as well.
Over the past decade of investigation, a little more each year, interesting finds were beginning to paint a true picture of the history of the valley.
From our excavations, we have quite a lot of really high status 9th and 10th century, what would be called Hiberno-Norse, which is an archaeologist's way of saying Viking material culture. That's really good, high quality material. So that is showing that whoever was here at the time, they had access to very, very high quality resources, very high quality jewellery.
So this beautiful little pin with a silvered head, this is a very important object. It may have been worn by a very high-ranking ecclesiastic. It was found within the remains of a little wooden and stone house that come from the excavation in the 1950s by François Henri of Temple na Skellig.
There was probably two items that were very striking for me. One was a tiny bronze mount, heavily corroded, looked like a nasty green lump. And after much cleaning, it turned out it was gilt, and it would have had the appearance of being pure gold from probably the 8th century. So it's one of our earliest objects we found. And in fact, that's what's on the site t-shirt now.
We have a beautiful little jet black cross, about 1 centimetre across, with a tin motif inlaid on it. One of only about 30 of those objects from Europe. It's probably 13th century. The distribution is Northern Britain, Ireland, Trondheim in Norway and Greenland. So that's an object which is immediately telling us about how Glendalough is bound into networks of trade and exchange and mobility in a Christian world. This is the North Atlantic Christian world.
We've several pieces of small, nasty pottery, but when we analyse them, it turns out they're from the Bordeaux region in France. Suddenly you get to take a map of Europe and start putting dots on of where objects have come directly to Glendalough. And if the historical sources can't often do that. So for us, getting that but fine detail, but also setting Glendalough in a larger context.
It was a deposit that contained large amounts of charcoal. That charcoal was a dump of burnt material. Someone threw that into the ditch. It landed against the silt. So we know a sequence that the charcoal is after the silt is after the revetment itself. And we have a radiocarbon date from that charcoal of approximately 700 AD.
One of the most exciting discoveries is something that most people wouldn't find very interesting at all. It was bits of charcoal, burnt wood. It was associated with ironworking, and when these charcoal fragments were sent to the laboratory, they were found to date to the 5th century. And it's the earliest evidence for occupation at Glendalough. So it suggests that the story that was later written down in terms of the lives of St. Kevin contains this grain of truth about the monastery moving from the upper lake to the lower lake.
Then you also get some of the structures and the features we've recovered. So the excavations we've been working on next to the main monastic complex, we're pretty confident now that what we've discovered is the original enclosure ditch of the monastery itself.
On the far side of the ditch is a complex of pits and post holes, including very substantial post holes, posts that may have been 30 by 30 centimetres, squared off timbers, perhaps standing 3, maybe 4 metres tall. And some of those being dated to around about 800 AD, so perhaps contemporary of some of the earlier phases of activity at the monastic complex.
So originally the monastic complexes have a wall So they done the research to try and understand, is there a wall, is there not, where could it be? And then over time they thought it was actually a watercourse that was being manipulated from the Glendalough Sand, which falls up above the site. I suppose the main structure itself confuses everyone in terms of it was really wide and then it got smaller, and then what way were they manipulating the water?
So it's filling in the gaps between, which is actually quite amazing. I didn't realise myself in all those years ago when I was doing those tours. I thought we knew the story and that was it. You had your 6th century, you had 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, then the dissolution, and then that was it. And so I suppose we're finding out there was so much more before that and so much more in between.
So after the years of research and digging, is there anything more to be investigated in Glendalough?
There are fundamental research questions here still about things we think we know about Glendalough, but most of it's based on historic sources, and we have potential to do more work.
To find a direct link from Rome would be stunning. I'd be just as interested in a way of finding a Glendalough pilgrim's token. Many of the major monastic sites had pilgrims' tokens that I suppose hawkers and the religious communities would sell or vend to people. We don't have one of those on the site. So how Glendalough portrayed itself, I would be interested to see.
Ultimately, the key finding would be is to describe, if you were a visitor to one of the premier monastic sites in Ireland in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, what would it look like? It's something people still debate, historians, archaeologists still debate over it, and I think to kind of flesh that out through targeted excavation, geophysical survey, is the key, is the goal.
So from the work, say, that UCD are doing in the field between St Mary's Church and the Round Tower, that's at the moment that's just a blank field, but that could be down the line in 10 years' time. That could be where you might start your visit to Glendalough. You might have a tour around there on an archaeological site and explaining where the walls of the monastery are suspected, showing where there's evidence of industrial activity and mill wheels and things like that, talking about industrialisation in the valley. So this could be a whole different way of telling the story of Glendalough.
So yeah, there's lots of possibilities for archaeology here, and to do archaeology which is telling great stories and which is engaging people, helping them understand their heritage and helping us manage and preserve that heritage as well.